He had the badge, the command, the kind of confidence that usually ends a moment before it begins. The boy had none of that. Just a backpack, a quiet street, and no time to understand why he was suddenly on the ground. But someone saw it. Not a crowd. Not a camera crew. Just one woman, standing still, taking in every detail. And before the officer understood who she was, something had already begun to turn. What happens when the person you dismissed is the one who can undo you? The street was quiet in the kind of way that made everything feel settled. Late afternoon light stretched across the pavement, soft and steady, as if nothing urgent could happen there. The boy walked along the sidewalk with his backpack slung over one shoulder, moving at an easy pace. His mind wasn't on anything important, just fragments of the day, small thoughts drifting in and out. A car passed. Ding, Inaza. Nothing unusual. He checked his phone briefly, then tucked it away, glancing up just as a police cruiser rolled slowly into view. It wasn't speeding. It wasn't loud. Just present. He noticed it the way anyone would, but it didn't pass. Instead, it slowed further, then stopped. For a moment, he thought nothing of it. Maybe they were looking for someone. Maybe it wasn't about him. Then the door opened. The officer stepped out. Already watching him, that was the moment something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make the air feel different. The boy paused, unsure why his chest felt tight. He hadn't done anything, so why did it suddenly feel like he had? The command came quickly, cutting through the quiet without hesitation. The boy froze, more from confusion than fear. He turned slightly, trying to understand what was happening. His expression caught somewhere between questioning and compliance. Hands where I can see them. They already were. He lifted them anyway. There was no explanation. No context. Just instructions stacking on top of each other, faster than he could process. His voice came out and asked, "What did I do?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his tone sharpening. As if resistance had already been decided, I said, "Don't move." "I'm not." The words didn't even finish. A sudden crack split the air. The sound came first, then the force. His body seized before his mind could catch up, muscles locking, knees collapsing under him as the ground rushed up fast and unforgiving. The world blurred. Pain wasn't the first thing, it was confusion. A deep, disorienting shock that didn't make sense. He hadn't run. He hadn't argued, and yet here he was, on the pavement, unable to move. While the officer stood over him like the outcome had always been certain, the officer's voice was steady, controlled, as if nothing unusual had just happened. He adjusted his stance, one hand still positioned near the taser, the other already reaching for restraints. The boy tried to speak, but his words came out uneven, tangled between breaths that wouldn't settle. His body had fully recovered, muscles still twitching in small, involuntary movements. He wasn't resisting. He couldn't, it didn't matter. Stop resisting. The officer said anyway. The phrase landed with a kind of finality, as if saying it made it true. A passing car slowed. Someone across the street had stopped walking. There were eyes now watching, uncertain, quiet. The officer didn't look at them. He kept his focus downward, controlling the scene, controlling the narrative before it could become anything else. Every movement deliberate, every word measured. The boy was turned onto his side, then onto his stomach, the cold surface pressing against his cheek. His hands were pulled back, secured without pause. No explanation came, just procedure. just authority, and as the cruiser's radio crackled faintly in the background, something else settled into place, not just what had happened, but what would be said about it by the time the report was written. The moment had already changed. On paper, it didn't begin with confusion. It began with suspicion. The officer described a non-compliant subject, someone who refused lawful commands and posed a potential threat. The language was clean, controlled, familiar. There was no mention of hesitation, no mention of the question the boy had asked, no space for the seconds where nothing had happened, just escalation presented as necessary in the official version. The taser wasn't sudden. It was justified. A response to resistance that had been clearly observed, clearly documented, except it hadn't been. Anyone who had been there would have remembered the silence before it, the lack of movement, the confusion, but the report didn't leave room for memory. IT replaced IT by the end of the shift. The narrative was already set, logged, filed, backed by procedure and phrasing that carried weight simply because it sounded certain. And once it was written that way, it became harder to question, not because it was true, but because it looked official. At the hospital, the room felt smaller than it should have. Machines hummed softly, their steady rhythm filling the quiet space as the boy lay still. Eyes half open, body finally beginning to settle. The visible damage was minimal, no broken bones. No lasting marks, but something about the way he moved, the way he didn't speak right away, made it clear that not everything could be measured. A nurse adjusted the blanket. Another checked his vitals. Routine, calm, practiced. Then the door opened. His mother stepped in without hesitation. Her presence immediate but controlled. She didn't rush to him. She didn't panic. She took in the room, first the monitors, the posture, the small details others might miss. Then she moved closer. What happened? She asked quietly. The boy looked at her, searching for words that didn't quite come together. Confusion lingered, heavier now, mixed with something else he didn't know how to name. I didn't do anything, he said finally. She didn't respond right away, but something in her expression shifted, subtle, precise, as if she had already begun to understand more than what was being said. Back at the department, the conversation was shorter than it should have been. The report was reviewed, nodded through, and accepted with minimal friction. No one asked for more detail. No one pressed on the timing, the escalation, or the lack of clarity. It fit. That was enough. Supervisors signed off, trusting the structure more than the situation. The language followed policy. The sequence matched expectation. There was nothing, officially, to question, and once it moved through the system, it became part of it. The officer wasn't isolated. He was supported quietly, efficiently, without discussion. His version was now the version, not because it had been proven, but because it had been processed outside. The street had already returned to normal, the moment itself fading, replaced by routine inside. IT was sealed, but not completely, because while the department moved forward, closing gaps before they could widen, there was someone else who hadn't accepted the version placed in front of them. Someone who wasn't looking at the report the same way and wasn't planning to let it end there.
She didn't raise her voice, even as the details came together slow, incomplete and uneven. She remained still beside the hospital bed, listening more than speaking. The boy repeated himself in fragments, the same sentence circling back again and again. I didn't do anything. Each time. She nodded once, not to reassure him, but to acknowledge that she had heard him clearly. What did he say before? She asked. The boy hesitated. Tried to remember. There wasn't much to recall, just commands, sharp and fast, stacked without explanation. He didn't tell me anything. She absorbed that without reaction. No sigh. No visible frustration. Just a quiet shift in her posture, as if something had aligned internally. Her gaze moved briefly toward the door, then back to her son, measuring not just his condition, but the absence of answers. Did you move? She asked. He shook his head. That was enough. Not because it proved anything yet, but because it narrowed everything down. She reached for his hand. Holding it gently, her expression unchanged. But behind that stillness, something had already started moving. She left the hospital without urgency, but not without direction. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, sharper. She paused for a moment, scanning the street as if placing herself back into the world beyond the room. Then she walked toward her car, her movements steady, deliberate. Her phone remained in her hand. Screen dark. She didn't call anyone, not yet. Inside the car, she sat without starting the engine, her eyes fixed forward. There were things she knew instinctively, patterns she recognized without needing confirmation. The phrasing her son described. The speed of escalation. The absence of explanation. None of it felt unfamiliar, but she didn't rely on instinct alone. Instead, she reached into the center console and pulled out a small notebook. Worn, but organized. She flipped it open. Scanning pages filled with short entries, dates, names, fragments of incidents that had once seemed unrelated. Now, they didn't. She added a new line, simple, precise. Then closed it. Still no calls. No outward reaction, but something about the way she moved, quiet, contained, suggested this wasn't the first time she had seen something like this, and not the first time she had decided to act. The next morning, nothing appeared different. The department opened on time. Officers moved through their routines. Reports were filed, calls were answered, and the previous day settled into the background like it always did. But not everything followed the same pattern. Across town, she walked into a building that didn't look connected at all. No uniforms. No visible ties to law enforcement. Just a quiet office space where conversations happened behind closed doors. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. A receptionist looked up, recognized her immediately, and stood without hesitation. "Good morning," she said. The response was respectful, familiar. The kind of recognition that wasn't given casually. She nodded once and continued inside, passing through without pause, her presence acknowledged without question. No explanations exchanged. No introductions needed. Inside, she placed her bag down and opened a file. Not her son's. Not yet, but something older. Something that had been waiting. She didn't approach this as a mother demanding answers. She approached it as someone who understood how answers were found, quietly, methodically, and without warning anyone that they were already being watched. The street looked ordinary again. Cars passed. People walked by without slowing. If you didn't know what had happened there, you wouldn't notice anything at all. But when the footage was pulled piece by piece, it told a quieter, more complicated story. The nearest camera caught the moment before the cruiser stopped. The boy walking. No urgency. No sudden movement. Just a normal pace, uninterrupted. Then the frame shifted. The angle missed the exact moment the officer stepped out. Another camera should have filled that gap, but it didn't. The feed cut just seconds too early, replaced by a brief static interruption that wasn't explained anywhere in the logs. A third camera picked up the aftermath. The boy already on the ground. The officer standing over him. No clear escalation. No visible threat. Just a jump between calm and control with nothing in between. Whoever reviewed it the first time had moved on quickly, marked it as consistent, acceptable. But now, watching it again, slower something felt off. Not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. The officer's file wasn't empty. At first glance, it looked clean. Standard evaluations. Routine commendations. Nothing that would raise immediate concern. But buried beneath the surface, there were notes short, easily overlooked, written in language that softened their impact. Use of force reviewed. No further action required. Complaint unsubstantiated. Each entry closed quickly. Individually, they meant little. Together, they started to form something else. The dates weren't far apart. The circumstances varied, but the outcome stayed the same. No escalation on record. No sustained findings, no consequences that lasted. Just repetition. There were patterns in the timing, too. Late shifts. Isolated areas. Situations where there were fewer witnesses, fewer angles, fewer questions. Nothing conclusive. But not random either. Whoever had written those summaries had chosen their words carefully. Enough to document. Not enough to trigger action. And that was the problem. Because once you looked past the phrasing, past the structure, a different picture began to take shape, one that didn't rely on a single incident. One that suggested this wasn't the first time something had gone too far. Inside the department, no one said anything directly. But the silence wasn't empty. Conversations paused when certain names came up. Looks were exchanged, quick, subtle, gone before they could be noticed openly. It wasn't fear exactly. More like awareness. The kind that builds slowly over time and settles in without needing to be confirmed. He's just intense sometimes. The comment was quiet, almost dismissive, spoken near a desk where paperwork stacked higher than attention allowed. No one challenged it. No one agreed either. It hung there. Another voice, lower this time, depends who he's dealing with. That one wasn't repeated. Not because it wasn't heard, but because it didn't need to be. Everyone understood what it implied. Still, nothing moved officially. No reports reopened. No statements changed. The structure held the same way it always did. But beneath it, something had shifted. Not enough to break anything. Just enough to make people watch more carefully. And as those small, unspoken details began to collect between footage that didn't align, records that felt incomplete, and conversations that never quite finished, the distance between what happened and what was written about it began to close, slowly, but not quietly anymore. The body cam footage should have clarified everything. Instead, it complicated it. At first, it played like the report described controlled, structured, aligned with the written version. The officer's voice was steady. Commands were clear. The sequence appeared clean. But when it was reviewed more closely, the timing didn't hold. There was a gap, small, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it. A fraction of time where the audio dipped, the visual stuttered, then resumed just slightly out of sync. Not enough to flag automatically, but enough to raise a question. The moment before the taser deployment felt compressed, as if something had been removed or shifted forward. The boy's voice, barely audible, cut in mid-word, then disappeared entirely in the next frame. No full exchange. No visible resistance. Just a transition that moved too quickly from instruction to force. Someone paused the footage, rewound it, played it again. Each time, the same thing. Not proof of alteration, but not consistent either. And once that possibility entered the room, it didn't leave. Because if the footage couldn't be trusted completely, then neither could the version built around it. The first witness didn't come forward publicly. They spoke quietly, off to the side, choosing their words with care as if measuring how much they could say without stepping too far. It wasn't a full statement. More like a correction. He didn't run. That was it. But it was enough. A second voice followed, not directly connected, not coordinated, but similar in tone. I saw him stop. No mention of resistance. No sudden movement. Just stillness before everything changed. Individually, the accounts were small, easy to overlook. But together, they began to align in ways the report didn't, and slowly they grew. A passing driver, a neighbor near the corner, someone who had paused just long enough to see more than they intended. None of them spoke loudly. None of them wanted attention. But they spoke anyway, carefully, consistently, and with each quiet addition, the space between what was written and what was seen widened just a little more. Not enough to break the story yet, but enough to make it harder to hold together without question. He noticed it before anyone said anything directly. The shift wasn't obvious. No one confronted him. No one pulled him aside. But the atmosphere had changed in ways that didn't need to be explained. Conversations ended a second earlier when he approached. Briefings felt shorter. Responses more measured. Even routine interactions carried a slight hesitation, like something unspoken was sitting just beneath the surface. At first, he dismissed it. Part of the job. Part of the noise. But then came the request. A review of the footage. Standard, they said. Just procedural. Still, it lingered. He replayed the incident in his head, not the exact details, but the outcome. The way it had resolved. The control he had maintained. It had been justified. It had to be. And yet, the more he thought about it, the less certain that feeling became. Not because he remembered it differently, but because of how it was being looked at now. Not accepted. Not assumed. Examined. For the first time since it happened, the situation didn't feel finished. It felt open. And that was something he couldn't control. The meeting wasn't announced. No internal memo. No department-wide notice. Just a quiet shift in the schedule that pulled a handful of senior staff into a room that was usually reserved for closed discussions. She walked in without hesitation. No introduction was made. It wasn't needed. The room adjusted around her. Presence almost immediately. Chairs straightened. Voices lowered. Posture changed in ways that only happened when someone important had entered without needing to say it. She didn't sit at first. Instead, she placed a thin folder on the table and opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the pages like she had already memorized them. This incident, she said calmly, has already been reviewed. No one interrupted. No one asked how. Because they understood something in that moment, not from her words, but from the way she spoke them. This wasn't a parent raising a complaint. This was someone with standing. Authority. The kind that didn't need to be declared out loud. And as the realization settled across the room, the perspective shifted not just on the case, but on who had been quietly watching it from the beginning. The reaction moved faster than anything before it. Within hours, The tone inside the department changed completely. What had been routine became urgent. What had been accepted became questionable. Files were reopened. Footage was requested again, this time without shortcuts. Logs were cross-checked. Timelines re-examined. Small details that had been overlooked were now placed under direct scrutiny. No one dismissed the inconsistencies anymore. Not after they understood who was involved. Conversations that had once been quiet turned sharper, more precise. Supervisors who had signed off without hesitation now revisited their decisions, careful with every word, every step. The shift wasn't loud, but it was immediate, because authority had entered the situation in a way that couldn't be ignored or delayed. And more importantly, it wasn't external. It was inside. That was what unsettled them the most. This wasn't pressure from outside the system. It was the system being forced to look at itself clearly, directly, and without the usual protections. And once that started, it couldn't be contained the way it had been before. He found out in a way that didn't feel official. No briefing, no direct statement. Just a passing comment, quiet, almost casual, but delivered with a weight that didn't match its tone. You know who that was, right? He didn't answer immediately. Didn't need to, because something in the way it was said already told him this wasn't a simple question. His mother. A pause. Then, more carefully, she's not just his mother. That was when it settled. Not all at once, but enough to change everything. The incident replayed in his mind again, but differently this time. Not just the moment itself, but the context around it. The person he had assumed he was dealing with. The situation he believed he controlled. It wasn't the same anymore. Because now, the edges of that moment extended far beyond the street, beyond the report, beyond anything he had accounted for. And for the first time, the certainty he had relied on wasn't there. Not replaced. Just gone. Leaving something else in its place. Something quieter. Heavier. And far less predictable than anything he had prepared for.
The inquiry began without spectacle. No press release. No public statement. Just a formal notice issued internally, precise in its wording and impossible to ignore. The case was no longer routine. It had been elevated. A review board was assembled, carefully selected, removed from direct involvement, positioned to look at the situation without the usual influence. Timelines were established. Evidence requests formalized. Every step documented. This time, nothing moved casually. Files that had once passed quickly through approval were reopened with intention. Bodycam footage was requested in its original format. Surveillance logs were pulled again, cross-referenced against timestamps that had previously been accepted without question. Even the report itself was treated differently. Not as a conclusion, but as a claim, and that changed everything. Because now, every word inside it had to hold under scrutiny. Every sequence had to align. Every justification had to stand on its own. The process was quiet, but structured in a way that didn't allow for shortcuts. For the first time, the incident wasn't being managed. It was being examined. And once that shift took place, the outcome was no longer something that could be controlled from the inside. The contradictions didn't appear all at once. They surfaced slowly, in small details that didn't align the way they should have. A timestamp slightly off. A command that wasn't fully captured. A movement described in the report that didn't appear in any available footage. Individually, they were minor. Together, they formed something harder to dismiss. The bodycam gap became more significant under review. The missing seconds weren't just a technical issue, they interrupted the exact moment where justification was supposed to exist. Witness statements added, wait, consistent, independent, unconnected. Each. One describing the same thing, compliance, not resistance. And as those accounts were placed alongside the officer's report, the difference became clearer not just in what was said, but in what couldn't be supported. The narrative began to shift, not dramatically, but steadily, from certainty to doubt, from assumption to question, because the more the evidence was aligned side by side, the less it supported a single version. And once that happened, the officer's position wasn't just challenged. It was weakened. Not by accusation, but by the absence of confirmation where it mattered most. Inside the department, the unity that had once held everything together started to fracture. It didn't break openly, but it shifted. Some stood by the original report, not out of certainty, but out of habit. Trust in the system meant trusting what had already been approved. Changing that meant questioning more than just one incident. Others didn't see it that way. They had watched the footage again, read the statements, notice the gaps, and they couldn't ignore them. Conversations became quieter, but sharper. Disagreements didn't escalate into arguments, but they didn't resolve either. They lingered, unresolved, sitting just beneath the surface of routine interactions. Supervisors moved carefully, aware that every decision now carried weight beyond procedure. What had once been simple approval now required justification, and that pressure spread. Not evenly, but enough to be felt, because the case was no longer contained to a single moment or a single officer. It had reached into the structure itself, and as those internal lines began to shift between loyalty and accountability, between silence and acknowledgement, the outcome became harder to predict. Not because the truth was unclear. But because not everyone was ready to accept it at the same time. Asterisk. The decision came through without warning. Not in a meeting, not in a discussion. Just a formal notice, direct, brief, and final in tone. The officer was being placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. It wasn't dramatic. But it was enough. His badge wasn't taken in front of anyone. His exit wasn't announced. Still, the effect moved quickly through the department. People noticed. They always did. For the first time since the incident, something had shifted from internal review to visible consequence. It wasn't resolution, but it was movement. Those who had been watching quietly felt at first a subtle release of tension that had been building beneath every conversation. Not relief in the sense of closure, but in the sense that the situation was no longer being held in place. Action had been taken, even if it was only the beginning. Because administrative leave didn't answer anything. It didn't explain the footage. It didn't resolve the contradictions, but it acknowledged something important. That the version of events once accepted without question could no longer stand on its own. The story didn't stay contained. It moved outward. Slowly at first shared between small circles, repeated in quiet conversations. Picked up by people who hadn't been there, but understood enough to recognize what it meant. Then it widened. A short clip surfaced. Not the full incident, not complete, but enough to show the moment after the boy on the ground, the officer standing over him, the tone of control that felt too quick, too final. It spread without urgency. But it spread. Questions followed, not loud ones, not immediate outrage, just steady, persistent attention from people who wanted to understand how something like that could happen so quickly, and why it had been accepted so easily. The department felt it, Requests for information increased. Statements were reviewed more carefully. Responses were measured. Aware now that the situation wasn't just internal anymore. The space around the case tightened, because once attention moves beyond controlled environments, it changes the pace of everything. And now, there were more eyes. Not just watching, but waiting. He tried to hold on to the original version, repeated it the same way it had been written, clear, structured, confident. He described the situation as it had been reported, relying on the same phrasing that had carried him through the initial review, but it didn't land the same way anymore. Not when the questions were different, not when the details were being examined instead of accepted. Why isn't the moment of resistance visible? Why does the timeline not match? He answered as best he could, stayed within the boundaries of his report, but each response seemed to create another gap, another space where certainty should have been, but wasn't. The consistency he depended on began to weaken, not all at once, but enough, because the more he spoke, the more the focus shifted not to what he was saying, but to what couldn't be supported. And that was something he couldn't correct. Not with explanation. Not with repetition. For the first time, the narrative wasn't holding. It was unraveling slowly, but in a way that couldn't be stopped by control alone. And with each passing moment, the distance between him and the outcome grew smaller.
When everything was finally placed together, the gaps disappeared, not because they had been filled, but because they were now understood. The missing seconds in the footage aligned with the exact moment the report claimed resistance. The witness statements, once quiet and separate, formed a consistent timeline that no longer left room for interpretation. The language in the report, carefully structured, stood in contrast to what could actually be verified. There had been no escalation. No visible threat. No movement that justified what followed. The sequence was clear now. Instruction, confusion, force, nothing in between. And once that version was reconstructed fully, without interruption, it didn't require argument. It didn't need emphasis. It stood on its own. The truth hadn't been hidden completely. It had been fragmented, rearranged, presented in a way that made it easier to accept. But now, with every piece aligned, that version couldn't hold anymore. Not against what was consistent, not against what remained the same across every independent account. For the first time, the incident wasn't being interpreted. It was understood. The outcome came through the same system that had once protected him, but it didn't function the same way now. The findings were formal, detailed, and impossible to soften. The use of force was deemed unjustified. The report was found to contain statements that couldn't be supported by evidence. Policy had not been followed. Procedure had not been respected. And that carried consequences. His position was terminated, not suspended, not reassigned. Ended. There were additional steps outlined, reviews beyond the department, actions that extended outside internal control. The case had moved beyond something that could be resolved quietly. For those who had followed it closely, the decision didn't come as a surprise, but it mattered. Not because it reversed what had happened, but because it acknowledged it clearly, without adjustment. Without protection. The system had reached a point where it couldn't maintain the original version any longer, and instead of reshaping it again, it had allowed the conclusion to reflect what the evidence showed. That was where the shift truly happened, not in the punishment itself, but in the willingness to apply it. Inside the department, the response was different this time. There was no attempt to move past it quickly, no effort to minimize what had occurred. The findings had been too clear, too structured to ignore or redirect. Supervisors addressed it directly, not just the incident, but the process around it, the way the report had been accepted, the way earlier concerns had been closed without deeper review. The reliance on structure over substance. It wasn't framed as a single failure. It was recognized as something broader. System that had functioned as designed but not as needed. That acknowledgement didn't resolve everything, but it shifted the tone. Training protocols were revisited, review procedures adjusted. Language that had once passed without question was now examined more closely, not because the system had changed completely, but because it had been forced to see where it hadn't been working. For some, that realization came with discomfort. For others, with a sense of overdue clarity. Either way, the incident no longer existed as an isolated moment. It had become a reference point, not just for what happened, but for what had been allowed to happen before it was finally seen clearly. Recovery didn't happen all at once. At first, it showed up in small ways, the way he walked without hesitation, the way his voice steadied when he spoke about what happened. The confusion that had once filled every sentence slowly gave way to clarity, not because the memory faded, but because it no longer felt unresolved. He understood it now, not just the moment itself, but everything around it, the questions, the investigation, the outcome. It didn't erase what he felt on the ground that day, but it placed it in a space where it made sense. You didn't do anything wrong. He had heard that before, but now it felt different. Not just reassurance, confirmation. He didn't carry the same uncertainty anymore. What had happened to him wasn't something he had to explain or defend. It had already been seen, recognized, and that changed how he moved forward. Not with anger, not with fear, but with a quiet understanding that what happened mattered, and that it had been acknowledged in a way that wouldn't be taken back. She didn't speak about the case publicly, not in detail. When it was addressed, her words stayed measured, focused less on the incident itself and more on what followed. Process, accountability, the responsibility of leadership to see clearly, even when it's uncomfortable. She stood behind the outcome without emphasizing her connection to it. That part remained unspoken because it didn't need to be said. Inside the department, her presence carried a different weight now, not because it had changed, but because it had been understood. The same calm authority that had guided the investigation remained, but it was recognized more openly. Decisions moved with more intention. Reviews carried more depth. Not perfectly, but differently. She didn't present it as a correction. She treated it as a standard, something that should have been there already. And by holding to that without raising her voice, without making it personal, she made something else clear, that accountability wasn't an exception. It was an expectation. And it would remain that way. In the end, the moment itself didn't disappear. It remained on the street where it happened, in the footage that was reviewed, in the records that were rewritten to reflect what had actually taken place. But it didn't exist the same way anymore. It wasn't just an incident. It was a shift. A point where assumption gave way to examination, where control was replaced by accountability, where a version of events, once accepted without question, was seen clearly for what it was. The officer had believed he understood the situation, believed he held the authority to define it, but that authority had limits. And when those limits were reached, something else took its place, not louder, not more forceful, but more precise. The truth. It didn't arrive all at once. It didn't announce itself. It built, quietly, through details that couldn't be ignored and questions that didn't go away. And when it finally settled, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt clear. The kind of clarity that doesn't need emphasis, only recognition. Because in the end, it wasn't about who had power. It was about who was willing to use it correctly.